All right, so to get things started today, first off, for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Terry Mason. I'm the president of Batten's Graduate Council here, and I was also an intern this summer at the Federal Executive Institute. It is there that I became acquainted with Dr. Greg Gifford, who is the dean of FEI here in Charlottesville. Dr. Gifford is actually responsible for being one of the primary architects of FEI's flagship program, that is the Leadership for a Democratic Society. This is a 4-week intensive course in which GS-15s and senior executive service members are put through an intensive 4-week program that consists of leadership development training, looking at all the intricacies that come with serving in federal government, the foundation of which is the Constitution that they study within the first week of programming, serves as the foundation for their sort of purpose-driven mission within the government. Dr. Gifford also serves on the board of directors for the Association of Leadership Educators. He is one of the foremost authorities of the Myers-Briggs type indicator within the federal government, and he also has a PhD in leadership studies. Dr. Gifford has taught courses on interpersonal leadership development, team leadership, work motivation, and leadership theory. But beyond all that, Dr. Gifford is a great guy. He was a big help to me this summer, and I look forward to hearing his talk. So round of applause, please.
All right, well, thank you to Terry and to everyone who helped arrange for me to be here today. It's interesting to me that just a couple miles down Emmett Street, the federal government owns and operates a 16-acre campus where we work really hard in terms of developing the executive leaders, the executive cadre of the career civil service who, especially right now as we look to transition administrations, those career civil servants become pivotal to the continuity of our federal government. So the work that we're doing there, I think, has some synergy around what you're doing here, focusing more on the areas of leadership and public policy. And so while FEI certainly has a place in terms of how we think about implementing policy, our focus is primarily on leadership development, and so that's what I'm going to focus my talk on today. So this is just a little bit of what I'm going to cover. I want to talk about how leaders create meaning and how that becomes unique and special for us. And then I want to talk you through about how we focus or try to focus development at an individual level and why that's so important even in a complex bureaucracy where sometimes training or development becomes a one-size-fits-all solution. Then I also want to talk about employee engagement. That's a hot topic these days, and what that means for the millennial generation in the workforce. Many of you belong to that generation, and so I want to hit on a couple of topics that I think will be interesting to the millennial generation, and then just talk very, very cursorily about the impact on government that generation will have. But before we do all of that, I want to start with a story. Apologies to Terry. He's heard me tell this story before. So this is Nkosi Johnson. Nkosi Johnson was a South African boy who had a major impact on his place in the world. Nkosi was born to a mother who was infected with the HIV virus, and so it's no surprise that Nkosi was born HIV positive. Nkosi's mom died when he was very young, and even before that, she had given him up for adoption when she was no longer able to take care of him. He was raised by his mother's friend, Gail Johnson. Nkosi was the kind of boy that never would sit still. He always had something that he had to be doing, and he never complained about it. But at a very young age, he turned that energy into a desire to help people. And so under Nkosi's guidance and leadership, there was a shelter established for women and children in South Africa who were HIV positive and needed a place to stay, a hot meal, and perhaps some medical care. Word of Nkosi's work was actually spreading over into the United States, and so U.S. author Jim Wooten heard of this work that Nkosi was doing, and he went to South Africa because he had to meet Nkosi Johnson. Jim spent a significant amount of time with Nkosi and ended up writing a book about Nkosi, which is entitled We Are All the Same. Nkosi was invited to speak in 2001 at the 13th International AIDS Conference. There he is on stage there. A few years later, Jim got word that Nkosi was very sick and would probably not live much longer. Nkosi was 12 years old and on his deathbed. So Jim Wooten flew back to South Africa to spend some final moments with Nkosi. And while he was there, beside him in his hospital bed, Jim asked Nkosi, "Why did you do all of this stuff for other people? What about you makes you want to do this work and work so hard?" And this was Nkosi's response. Do all you can with what you have, in the time you have, in the place you are. I think that's incredibly powerful, right? Do all you can with what you have, in the time you have, in the place you are. And I love Nkozi's story because it tells us something about leadership. Leadership happens from an individual level. It's not necessarily about authority or the title of the office you hold or anything of that nature. It's somebody who takes on an issue and a cause and rallies people around that cause. Rick Zuccaro, who is a psychologist here in the United States, was studying a number of years back looking for traits of leaders. That is, those innate natural things that we're born with that would essentially indicate whether or not one could be a good leader. And fortunately for my business, Zuccaro was not able to find that traits had any real impact on whether or not one could be a leader. Instead, what he found was that these were the things that great leaders were doing. There were 6 of them. Great leaders were able to inspire people. They were able to empower others. They were able to help people dream, to accomplish great things, to set a vision, and to focus people around that vision. Those 6 things, in a huge meta-study looking for leader traits, these were the things that people were saying great leaders actually did. And what's fascinating to me about that is they do it in this VUCA era that we're sort of living in, especially in the federal government, right? When we are notified hours in advance that we actually do need to come to work the next day because the government is actually not going to be shut down. It is an era which is known for its volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So it's fascinating to me that great leaders are doing great work and inspiring and empowering people to accomplish great things, even in a system and an environment that sometimes looks like this. So one of the things that I've been curious about and have been studying recently is how leaders are able to do that. What are they doing differently that others are not? So what we found in research is that 70% of how you make sense of a situation comes from the story that you tell yourself about that situation. Think about that. 70% of how you're making sense of what's going on around you is simply the narrative that's rolling around in your head. And so, for example, I use this example often. I think it connects well. That there was a time when the story that we told ourselves was that the world was flat. Right? And that if you were to sail off the horizon because the world was flat, then you would fall off of the planet. And so somebody had to challenge that notion, right? Somebody had to be brave and say, you know, I actually believe in this new thing that we're saying, that the universe does not center around Earth, and the Earth may in fact be round, and let's go explore. And so somebody was able to get a group of people on a ship to agree with that, knowing that in their heads, the story they previously were telling themselves that the world was flat. So great leaders help us create a different narrative, and they help us find meaning in our work. And I think that's what Nkosi did and why he was so inspiring, is that he was just a kid who wanted to help people, but he was telling a different story and helping people create meaning differently. Here's a local example, a more local example. This is John Michael Jackson. John Michael is a store manager in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, for a large coffee company that has a store on every block in every city. You know what that company is. So John's store is particularly successful. It's the most successful store in the region, definitely the most successful store in the city of Oklahoma City. And so the Starbucks folks were curious what was going on in John's store, and so they interviewed him to find out what he was doing differently in terms of his leadership. And this is what he said: I'm passionate about people, I'm passionate about building long-lasting relationships, and I believe the biggest and most critical asset on any team is open two-way communication. Well, there's nothing particularly novel about that statement, right? You can find that at your local Barnes & Noble leadership section. And so that's curious for me, because what's going on in terms of how John is talking about his leadership doesn't really seem to be having the same kind of glossy, shiny feeling that I thought that it would be. So what's really going on there in John's world? We'll come back to that in just a second. If you look at that from a development standpoint, I'm just taking 2 random variables here: employee engagement and capabilities of the leader. So in leadership development, or in development and training in general, what we like to do is think in averages, right? So we find the average of how a leader is doing on these 2 variables, employee engagement and capabilities. And we say, everybody who's below the average, we want to help you get to be above that average, right? And so that's an interesting way to look at data in organizations, but what's actually going on there is that it looks much more like this. At a much more granular level, you have individual team leaders in that organization that are all over the map in terms of how they're engaging their employees and what capabilities they have. So let's just take two examples here. We have two leaders with similar capabilities, and that leader at the top is, let's say, John Michael Jackson's store, coffee store in Oklahoma City. He has much higher levels of capability, or much higher levels of employee engagement, even compared with someone who has the exact same capabilities. So in leadership development, it's important for us not to look at the average or the line, but to really get in and find at the granular level, what is that person at the top doing that's causing them to engage their employees much more effectively than the person with the same equal amount of capability who seems to be struggling in that area? And if we can figure out what's going on in John Michael's store, and we can start talking to other leaders about, these are some of the things that John Michael Jackson's doing in his store, maybe you should try some of this and see what works for you. It's really getting at this idea that leadership is idiosyncratic. That I can give you a set of tools to use in your leadership world, but I can't give you a magic silver bullet. You have to figure out what that magic sauce is for yourself in your leadership, wherever that is happening. So how are we doing about this? This idea of engaging employees and doing it at an individual level. Marcus Buckingham, who for a long time worked with Gallup but has his own company now, developed the Global Engagement Index, where he looked at 4 variables to really get in and determine how individual leaders were affecting their individual team members. What's interesting about the Global Engagement Index is that in all 4 of these categories, there's a we component and a me component. This makes really good sense for surveying in the federal government because we sort of have a predisposition for purpose. Right? People are really excited. People in federal government get really excited and passionate about the mission of their organization. Right? So we can talk about that, but then I can also talk about how I, at an individual level, impact that mission, that purpose. Interestingly, the most powerful item in this survey is that one on excellence in the me category, that I have a chance to use my strengths every day at work. That's the one single best indicator in terms of how employees are being engaged. This survey did this survey around the world, 13 different countries. And what we found was that around the world, there's pretty much a range between 13 to 19% of employees saying they're engaged. So we have some work to do, right? Because that's not a very exciting thing, right? So we need to figure out what's going on in these leadership situations where people feel only 13 to 19% engaged. That's a scary number, I think. So here's my thinking on that. One is that we need to recognize that employee engagement is really 2 parts. It's about worth and self-concept. Right? My contributions are having an impact, and I believe in the capacity to do my job. Right? And so if we empower team leaders to have good conversations with their team members to figure out what contributions you're having and that you have the capacity to actually do what we want you to do, those are healthy and powerful conversations that, again, keeps leadership at an individual relationship level. Secondly, we find that leaders who are really successful in terms of having an engaged workforce do frequent check-ins about near-term future work. These are not lengthy conversations. These are 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, once a week with everyone on your team. Now, it's important that this is not a feedback meeting. Nobody likes to get feedback. I hear it all the time, right? Millennials like feedback. Millennials do not like feedback. We like attention. Coaching attention, right? So feedback is like, I threw the grenade over the other side of the fence and you're in pieces, but hey, I gave you feedback. Right, that's not what we want. We want your team leader to come around the fence and to have a healthy, productive conversation with you about what is your priority this week and how can I help? Those 2 questions seem to have a distinct impact on employee development and on employee engagement in organizations. 2 easy questions. What's your priority? How can I help? And if team leaders and team members are having those conversations once a week, then employee engagement scores go up, productivity goes up, you have a healthier, happier, more productive workplace. So what does that look like in terms of a millennials viewpoint? We're getting to a place in federal service where Nearly half of the federal workforce is eligible for retirement. We will move over half in the next few years. So over half of the federal workforce will be eligible for retirement. And we've talked for a long time about there being or preparing for this idea of a retirement tsunami. It hasn't really happened in the way that many people thought it would. However, we are starting to see the trickle of retirement becoming more and more of a steady stream. So for you all that are, most of you in this room, that are in the millennial generation, this should be interesting to you. So millennials, 336,000, just north of that, federal workers, so only 16% of the federal workforce. So we have room to grow, and it's no surprise, but our largest growth point will be with the millennial generation as the baby boomers retire. And so that'll be an interesting dynamic that shapes our workforce, our federal workforce, in the next few years. I think it's interesting, too, to note that 8 of 10 millennials are working outside of the DC region in federal government jobs. I have that conversation a lot. What would you like to do when you graduate with a degree in public policy or political science? I'd like to go work in DC. Well, surprisingly, and more and more so, federal jobs are located outside of the District of Columbia. So something for you all to be aware of. So this information was taken from the 2015 Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. We found in the 2015 survey that people are actually happier, more engaged this year. They're more enjoying their work than in 2014. It'll be interesting to kind of dig down there and see what that's about. But millennials in 2014 reported that about 62% that their organization was a good place to work. 2/3 of the millennials were satisfied with their jobs and suggest that their supervisors support their development. So that's really great news. I think that millennials in kind of early career positions that aren't always the most glamorous positions feel like people care about them. And that's sometimes all you really need to be happy, is just to know that your supervisor cares about you and is interested in your development. But most importantly, I think the statistic that 86% say the work that I do is important is really an interesting statistic. And I talked about how in federal government we seem to be predisposed to people having a mission and buying into that mission. And even at early career stages and kind of new jobs, millennials are saying that the work they do is important, and I think that's great. It goes to that old NASA story where, right, the janitor, if you ask the janitor at NASA what his job is, he says, I put people on the moon, right? And so he gets the mission. And it seems that millennials at a rate of about 86% are having that sort of mission focus, which is, I think, a powerful thing. Here's the current makeup of the millennial workforce. This is interesting as well because it shows the kind of range of options in which millennials are working, and a lot of it is in compliance and miscellaneous administration, that type of thing. A lot of folks working in contracting. It takes a whole army or a whole team of people to deal with the contracting issue, and of course, air traffic control. So that's kind of the breakout percentage-wise of where millennials are finding themselves in the federal workforce. So what we do at FEI and our challenge is that as you enter into the workforce, we want to support your development all through your career. So when you come in generally at a GS 7, 8, 9 level, we want to support your leadership development starting at that point. Knowing that you're an emerging leader, you have some skills that we would like to further develop so that when you promoted into a team leader or a manager or supervisor role, you've kind of developed those skills that are somewhat different throughout your career. Right? We use a competency model in the US government. I don't like competency models, but we have one. And so one of the competencies is oral communication. Right? And oral communication is important at a GS5, incoming new employee. It's also important at the senior executive level. Oral communication looks different, right? At the senior executive level, you need to be able to go and testify before Congress. Whereas if you're just coming in on an entry-level position, oral communication might just be able to have a good conversation with your supervisor or with your team, right? So we are trying to figure out ways to create pathways for that development to occur over the course of one's career so that you all, as you come into the workforce, are supported and developed throughout your career. So what does that mean? At the end of the day, I want to, again, make the point that leadership is an idiosyncratic thing. Leader development is an individual development thing. And so as you pursue opportunities to develop in that capacity, think about what it is that you need at an individual level. What skills do you need to be working on and developing, and focus on that thing. You don't need everything. And so as you individualize and prioritize development for you as an individual, it helps organizations know what they're investing in you. And then, of course, we have to be focused on equipping team leaders with the right tools. And if team leaders have the right tools and can have good conversations with their team, then we have a more productive, engaged federal workforce. I started with a story today, so I want to close out with one. Let me just get to my notes here. Does anybody know who this is? All right, well, this is Jim Goodnight. While working on his master's degree, he was curious about how we were sending a man to the moon. And so he was working as a federal contractor, doing some programming that landed him an opportunity to work more closely with the Apollo space program. While he was working on the Apollo program, Goodnight experienced a work environment that had an annual turnover rate of approximately 50%. 50% turnover annually in that organization. That's incredible. This particular phenomenon shaped his corporate views and culture, and certainly his future role as an employer and as a leader. Goodnight developed a project to create a general-purpose statistical analysis system for analyzing agricultural data. With 100 customers in 1976, Goodnight left his position in higher education and formed the SAS Institute. Goodnight remained CEO of the SAS Institute for more than 35 years as the company grew from $138,000 in its first year in business to $420 million in 1993, and then $2.43 billion by the year 2010, so rapid growth. Under his leadership, the company grew every single year. Goodnight became known for creating and defending SAS's corporate culture, often described by the media as utopian. He created a utopian work culture. That sounds pretty great. All right. So Goodnight, right before he retired, said that there was really nothing magic to his leadership or his culture. Instead, he said the magic was in how he saw people in the organization, which is this: treat employees like they make a difference, and they will. And again, it's that idea that leadership, whether you're a CEO or whether you're a team leader, if you treat employees at an individual level and develop them and focus on how you can help them, that seems to be the most effective way to lead. So I will stop there, and I guess we have some time to do some questions and answers. We can talk about anything you'd like to in terms of the federal government and what I just presented, that kind of thing. But if we could stay away from questions about Donald and Hillary, that's out of my park. So I'll turn it over to Terry.